Hello. Oh, awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so pumped everyone's here. It's so great to see you all. Welcome to the update on the Railbelt decarbonization study. My name is Franna. I'm with Information Insights, which is a women-owned small business in town. And I have the honor and privilege to be here working with ACEP on assisting for the public involvement process of this study. For today, the plan is to go from 6:30 to 8:30. If you all need to take a break, feel free to take that whenever you need to. We're going to have the presentation up here. There's going to be 2 opportunities for Q&A. They'll do a project overview with then some Q&A and then more specifics on the study and then some Q&A after that. Then the plan at the end is to do about 5 to 10 minutes of some polling questions to help the researchers figure out kind of like what's next for this project. And that will take either, for folks online, that can be like a separate window. For folks in the room, it would take a smartphone to be able to do the link. And we'll give you that information later. For the Q&A, so for our virtual participants, we have about 15 people online right now. So for the Q&A, go ahead and use the raise hand feature, and then we'll go ahead and unmute you, and you should be able to ask, so everyone in the room should be able to hear. And for in-person, the nice physical raising of the hand works just fine, and we'll bring around, we have 3 microphones, so I'll bring those to you, and then you can ask that question. All the Q&A, whatever you all ask will be recorded and then being able to be shared out with everyone after. If you have questions that might not have gotten answered or might not be exactly in line with the answers researchers can provide today, we still want to hear those questions and be able to record them and figure out if later we can get that answer. Part of the goal of all of this work that they're working really hard on is to continue this conversation on a larger public level about what it looks like to decarbonize the rail belt. And so any sort of involvement, questions, curiosities you have, we want all of those for this. The other pieces that are recording is happening right now by AUP in the back. And so the plan is for that to also be featured on the ACEP YouTube. So anyone can watch this again or share it with people as well. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it off to our researchers. Come on up.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me? All right. My name is Jeremy Vandermeer, and I'm not the lead on this project. Felicia is, but I'm going first. I'm a research assistant faculty at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I'm working with Felicia on this project.
I'm going to use this. Okay. Hi, I'm Felicia Cilio. I'm also research faculty at ACEP. I'm a trained power systems engineer, and I've been at ACEP for 3 years. So today, the next slide. So we have a project update on, so this is what we've been up to. We want to give an overview of what the project is doing, where we're going for anyone who hasn't heard about it before. And is that better? And some of our results. And right now, what we have to share are results from our load forecast, which includes adoption rates of from electrification, so electric vehicles, heat pumps, and residential solar. So ACEP is leading this project. ACEP is the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and we're a research institute at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Our mission is to develop, disseminate, practical, cost-effective, and innovative energy solutions for Alaska and beyond. We're really focused on creating practical solutions for Alaska as an applied research institute. And so this project fits well within our scope of work. We can go to the next slide. So the goal of this project is to explore and quantify pathways towards 100% Railbelt decarbonization in 2050. For those who aren't familiar, the Railbelt is Alaska's largest electric grid, and it spans from down in Homer through Anchorage up to Fairbanks and over to Delta Junction. This project started in spring of 2022, and it'll be wrapping up at the end of this year, early next year. The goal of this project is really to provide valuable information to Alaskan stakeholders. This is the public, this is board members or utilities that quantify the economic and reliability implications of these scenarios, and also provide just valuable information in general that are for these scenarios and for other studies that might be doing decarbonization work for this region. And last but not least is to build internal capacity within ACEP, within the state, to be able to answer some of these questions. So we'd like to recognize the team. There's a lot of people who are working on this. So there's numerous of us at ACEP that are working on this. And I think even those that aren't on this list, like everyone at ACEP at one point in time has touched this project. And we're very fortunate to work with Information Insights, as Jamie, Lisa, and Franna. Also the Alaska Microgrid Group, as Brian Rogers and Peter Asmuth, and Telos Energy, which is a consultant who works on energy projects year-round or around the country. Is this better? It's probably too low.
Right, tilt down when you do that, but maybe stand
up. Okay, this is better. All right, that's okay. We can go next slide. Thanks. All right, so I also want to recognize we are very privileged to have a technical advisory group. So we have lead engineers from each of the electric co-ops. This is Golden Valley Electric Association, Chugach Electric Association, Manuska Electric Association, Homer Electric, Alaska Energy Authority, and the members from the Railbelt Regional Coordination. So this team of people, they are providing data, they are reviewing our work and providing valuable insights on how real operations are on the Railbelt so we can make our study as accurate as possible. And we're funded by the Office of Naval Research and the State of Alaska through the Economic Development Capital Funding. And so our work is independent of all of these entities. The decisions we make are our own. We're really like a third party to all these, but we are very fortunate to have all these people participating. So go next slide. All right, Jeremy.
All right, so I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the different steps in this project that we have taken and are taking and will take. And these steps are similar to what you would see in other similar studies that are being done in other places as well. So we started off with trying to, well, coming up with the scenarios that we wanted to look into. And so here we are in 2023. And we want to achieve certain goals by 2050, decarbonization, affordability, that sort of stuff. And to get there, there's virtually unlimited pathways that you could take, options that you can take to get there. Some probably better, some maybe not so good, but there's a lot, and we don't know which way is the best way to get there. But we had to choose, certain, we're limited in our ability to look. We can't look at everything, so we have to choose certain pathways to focus on. So that's actually a fairly challenging thing to do, because you want to look into everything, but you have to really set your scope. Okay, we're only looking within this scope, and then you have to choose certain pathways, and how do you design those pathways? And so this was a big effort, and there's some iteration and input, a lot of input from stakeholders like you all, like the public, and they naturally evolved as well. So once we had the scenarios, then we did the resource assessment. So basically especially for the renewable resources, we had to, when we were doing our studies, we had to know how much, basically, in a year, how much energy you get from each of these sites each hour of the year. And so for wind and solar and tidal and hydropower, we had to find a bunch of different sites in the Railbelt that looked like they were good, they were under development, or just looked like they were good resources, and then collect either model data and real data and try to develop resources for those. And then load forecasts, the load is going to change between now and 2050 as well. And this is possibly one of the biggest question marks or unknowns in this study, is what's the load going to do? Because in the past, the load growth was relatively predictable, but we're starting to electrify loads like heating and transportation, and there's a lot of benefits with that, but it also means there's a lot of uncertainty in what might happen in terms of how much how much electrification is going to happen, what it's going to look like. And so the amount of load and when the load happens can really change. We're going to talk a bit more about that later, but that has huge implications to the grid. And then we take all that and then we do the generation analysis. And this is trying to answer the question of how much gets built, how much of what gets built where in your grid and how do you operate it, that kind of stuff. And basically the goal of the generation analysis is you're trying to minimize cost given certain input assumptions, while also making sure that you don't have any unserved load, that all the load on the grid gets served all the time. And that's what you're trying to do. And then you feed the output of that to the transmission analysis. And so they look, okay, here's what they say is supposed to happen, each hour of the year. And then the transmission analysis looks a little more in depth, and basically it sees, is it possible? Is it like laws of physics? Can you actually do what you say you're trying to do with, like, take into account all of your transmission system? And so it does the analysis under different like contingency conditions, and then there might be some iteration with the generation analysis to either, we got to change how you dispatch the system, so you got to run it differently, or you got to build different stuff to address any issues that the transmission analysis brings up. And then finally, you have the rate analysis, where we try to predict what the impact on rates could be for the different scenarios. So you're going to pay more, you're going to pay less. And of course, that's based on a lot of assumptions that we don't know, but it's at least, trying to get an indication. Yeah. And so, well, I guess if you go back a slide, actually. So we're going to talk more about the scenarios a little bit later. The next part of this presentation will be the results of the load forecast. Right now, we're going to go a little more, just touch on generation analysis and transmission analysis to kind of explain what they are a little bit more. So we'll start with the generation analysis. And again, so the questions we're trying to answer is, what do you build? Like, what do we build on the system? Between now and 2050, we're trying to meet our goals. We got to build a lot of new stuff. What do we build? There's tons of options. You got to know what you're going to build. You got to know where you're going to build it. And then you got to know how you're going to run this system, what runs, when, what's the load share going to be. And so these are hard questions to answer, just like using your head, right? Just trying to like guess. And so we have special, programs and software that automates this. And so essentially the process is we build a system, we run it for a full year, we calculate the cost of that. We build another system, we run that for a full year. We do that tens of thousands of times. We iterate and we approach a lowest cost system. And okay, there we go. Then we do a more detailed dispatch analysis with that and hand it off to the transmission study. And so our goal is, again, to minimize costs while making sure that there's power all for the load. And so we had 7 wind sites, 5 solar sites, 1 tidal site, that we could choose between to build or not build for those different sites. Nuclear, hydropower, transmission, batteries, demand response, these were all variables that we were able to play with. And we're answering really interesting and fun questions, such as, of course, like, what does a lowest cost system look like under certain assumptions, input assumptions? That's always kind of fun to see. And then, and so we're always, we're trying to minimize cost. And so we run the optimization to minimize costs, and then but you always have some residual fossil fuel generation in those systems. And so if you want to get to 100% decarbonization, what does that cost? So there's going to be some additional costs to get rid of that last little bit. And there's different ways that you could try to do that. And so that's kind of a really interesting question to see what that looks like. Sensitivity analysis to costs, and then of course the natural gas situation. How does that impact our analysis, and how's our analysis, how would that impact kind of our need and what we would do for natural gas? So thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna try this. Okay. All right, so next I'm going to go into transmission analysis. And so I just want to go over like, why is this important and why are we doing it? So I'd say the fundamental goal of transmission analysis is to identify and mitigate blackouts. So what are some questions we're trying to answer? So will this, like one question is, will the sudden loss of a generator or transmission line cause a blackout in the system? So say if North Pole power plant went out in Golden Valley, or if we lost the intertie down to Anchorage, is like all of Golden Valley going to lose power? Like under what circumstances might that happen? And so for an example of like why this matters, on the left, you have a system frequency plot of the Texas February event that happened in 2021, where there was a winter storm and they lost a lot of generation due to some generators not being winterized correctly. And so what happens is some generators go offline, and then you get a frequency drop. So happy frequency is 60 hertz. The lower that gets, you're at risk at damaging your generators. And if it gets too low, you will damage them. So what they do is they trip offline before they are damaged. But when you trip more generators offline, your frequency dips lower. So to prevent total frequency collapse, what you do is you drop load. So it's you and me at our homes and our neighborhoods are losing power, but it's pockets of power that are being lost, and this is preventing everyone in the system from losing their power. So like a full system blackout. So what you see in what happened in Texas, so all the red dots on this plot are people losing power. But what you don't see is the plot going like system like diving. That's not happening. Instead, you're coming back up, and that's because they dropped all these neighborhood loads. So a lot of people lost power. This was a big event. It was devastating, but not everybody lost power. And that's really important, because if everybody lost power, that's a lot harder to come back from than just bringing back power to certain neighborhoods. So the transmission analysis, what it's doing is it's identifying events like this that could cause cascading events. So we're identifying what's at risk, and then what can we do about it to prevent it from happening at all. And so what do you do to prevent things like this from happening? You need like devices, which I won't get into right now, or controls. And basically all these things cost money. So that's another reason why we care about it, because we want to get into this to figure out what devices and controls, which cost additional money, are needed to make these systems stable in the future. And that's going to impact us as ratepayers. So that's why we're doing this. And we go to the next slide. Oh yeah. So this is our timeline for the project. So some of you might have gone to our workshop last May, and that was our kickoff, and we talked about scenarios, and we made some adjustments after that workshop. So in the yellow is our public engagement reporting timeline, and then the blue are all our project components. And so you can see we started out with scenario development, went through resource assessment, load forecasting. We just wrapped up generation analysis. We're finishing transmission analysis right now. And then rate analysis will finish up in the next month. And then in January, we'll have a public report and another presentation like this that goes through all the results from all the components of the study. And then along the way, we've published some reports. They're all available on the ACEP website. And so one of them was the stakeholder survey summary. That was from our survey that we did last fall. And then resource assessment for hydro and pump storage hydro. And then the load forecast paper, which we're going to go through the results today. Go next. You want to touch on scenarios?
Sure. So like I said before, we started off with some original scenarios, and then we iterated based on feedback from people and just natural evolution of the scenarios. And so we started off, we had centralized, decentralized, export project scenarios, and where we currently are at, or the final scenarios are not going to change anymore. The high electrification focus scenario. And so what we're going to hear in the next section is our load forecast, and there's going to be an aggressive load forecast, and there's going to be a more moderate load forecast. So the high electrification focus is basically assuming what happens if there's a lot of electrification, if there's like a lot of electric vehicles, a lot of electric heating on the grid, and also if a relatively large portion of that was grid interactive, like the grid operators were able to change when you charge or when you use the electricity from these new electric loads. And so that's kind of the scenario, the high electrification focus. There's not really any big, non-wind or solar, there's a big title in there, but anyways, that's the focus of that one. The other three use the more moderate electrification load growth scenarios. And then we have the hydro focused one, which basically says, what if Susitna-Watana was built? Okay. And then And that's the big project in that one. The diverse mix is the big one. The big project in there is tidal, Cook Inlet tidal. What if that was developed? And then the last one is nuclear. And so nuclear is the only one that has nuclear in it. And for nuclear, we basically optimize how much nuclear, like based on cost, how much nuclear makes sense on the system. And so that was we optimized everything in the nuclear focus. So basically, each scenario kind of had its constraints and had, the input assumptions, and then the remaining components on the system like wind and solar and batteries, we did a grid, we optimized like how much gets built where, sort of given the input assumptions. Next slide. All right, so we're ready for questions now. Mike. Got a mic, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks for your time tonight. I'm just curious, when you're looking at generation capacity and what's potentially out there, why would you not do more with wind at this point in time, as opposed to, like, for example, you said you looked at tidal as a primary, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a lot more wind activity out there right now than there is tidal activity. And the likelihood is that probably that wind will come forward prior to that. So I'm just curious why you would exclude wind, which is just my guess, the closest reach for us at this point.
Right. Well, I just don't think wind's going to be very viable for Alaska. I'm kidding. No, so I guess, so wind and solar are common through all the scenarios. And so.
I thought I heard you throw them out twice.
No, so yeah, I kind of breezed through them. So wind, solar, batteries, and other things like transmission upgrades, those are included in all the other scenarios. And but they're not part of so each scenario has the input assumptions, like Cook Inlet tidal will get built. We don't really know how much it's going to cost, but this is, this project is being built. Now supply the rest of the power needs using, wind, solar, and, existing fossil generation. And so a lot of wind gets built in each scenario. So I guess I'll say, we're not really talking about results right now, but wind is a very dominant source of power in all scenarios.
That was my point.
Yeah.
That was my point.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you include that in your study here? So I was just curious about that.
We are all of the kind of roughly planned or talked about projects are included in all the scenarios. So there's a Little Mount Cicedna wind, a Shovel Creek wind, a Delta wind. Those are all in there. And I think we're talking in like hundreds of megawatts of wind. Not as much solar, but so those are all in there. Mm-hmm.
Is there anyone online that has any questions? You can go ahead, and we changed the permissions online so you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Give you all a minute. All right, any other questions for in-person or online?
All right, I think we start.
Do we just start the next one?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, we're diving right into the next one then. Okay, so now we'll talk about some results from the load growth projections that we've done. So we have the base load growth. We have assumptions for electrification of behind the meter loads. And then we have behind the meter generation. So we looked at solar, residential and commercial solar power. And again, so we'll go over some of the results that we got, but the load can change dramatically and probably will change incredibly dramatically by 2050. And so this is a very important thing to be considering when we think about our energy future. We have to be thinking, what's the load going to do? Because the amount of load and when the load happens really changes what makes sense for the system and what you have to do to accommodate it. So that's what we tried to do here. So for electrification, we had electric vehicles and heat pumps. And then we had behind the meter solar power. What's the next one? So we had two different kind of scenarios that we made up: the moderate adoption and the aggressive adoption. And the names kind of indicate, what the focus of each one is. But moderate adoption, we're trying to pick kind of middle of the road. We're trying to take, trends, current trends or current projections, and just try to think about, what's kind of like middle road projection out to 2050. Of course, in where we are now, we're very early on with on the road of electrification for a lot of things. So it's still very much a guess. And then with aggressive adoption, we tried to try to say, what sounds like a lot, what is a lot? So for aggressive, we just said 90% across the board. So that means 90% of homes get heat pumps, 90% of homes get solar power, 90% of vehicles become electric. So again, that sounds extreme, maybe it is, but again, we're talking about 2050. A lot, things are changing, a lot can change by 2050. Maybe it's unrealistic, maybe it's not. These are illustrative scenarios that are beneficial, to understand and think about what their implications. So, and then of course the minimum, we have the base load growth. So basically our current load profile, and then just, adjusted with projected population growth, but that doesn't change much. So we're mostly talking about electrification and behind the meter solar power. And we grouped the load into three main, we had three load projections. And this is the Railbelt. And so we have, we're Golden Valley Association up in the north. And then in the central area, we have Matanuska and Chugach Electric Associations. And in the south on the Kenai Peninsula, we have Homer Electric Association. So we grouped the load into these three northern, central, and southern regions. And they kind of naturally make sense because these are kind of somewhat well interconnected regions where they're like, one load center that are connected by extremely limited transmission. And so there's essentially, you could kind of break the Railbelt grid into three main areas. And so we made load growth projections for these three areas. And then the generation analysis ran assuming three regions. Yep. That's it.
So how do we even get started with figuring out what the load is going to be? So we're talking about things that impact buildings and vehicles. So we got to figure out what is out there to begin with. So we just looked at commercial and residential buildings for right now. We did not look at industrial. That's a potential large opportunity, but for at the moment, just commercial and residential. So we went to the boroughs and got property tax information and collected census data where there isn't property tax information to get building counts for each of those three regions that Jeremy mentioned. And then we did the same thing for vehicles, and we went to the Alaska Motor Vehicles, Department of Motor Vehicles for Alaska, and got numbers for all the registered vehicles that are in the communities in the Railbelt. So that's what these numbers represent, and they're the basis of, what are the adoption rates in the future as a percentage of total of these vehicles and buildings. So we're gonna start with electric vehicles. Good, nice one. So here we have historical and forecasted adoption rates for electric vehicles. So we have the blown up version of the historical data in the bottom left. So you can see we have significant increase. I think we've doubled in the past 5 years, the number of vehicles electric vehicles on the Railbelt. And then we compared to Alaska Energy Authority had made some forecasts that went out for a couple of years. And so we used those forecasts. We opted to go for the more aggressive one and extrapolated that to 2050 using a polynomial growth. So this is less aggressive than exponential growth and a little bit more aggressive than linear growth. And it roughly follows what was projected in the AEA's forecast for the next couple of years. So if you follow that out to 2050, what you get is 70.8% of vehicles on the Railbelt being electric vehicles. That's a lot. But if you think about it, this is a technology that is like a full transition technology. Like if lots of people do it, there's kind of like a tipping scale of like, if a lot of people have electric vehicles, there could be a large shift in the whole thing versus like solar on your house. Just because a whole bunch of people have solar on your house doesn't mean you're going to necessarily have solar on your house. It's not like a transition for the entire industry at the same time. So it makes sense that there's higher adoption rates of electric vehicles than, say, other technologies that we'll get into. But for perspective, we wanted to compare it against other regions, both regional, national, and global projections. And so you can see the X marks on the plot above our forecast. And so those are national and global projections. So we're below everywhere else, even though we're really high. And that makes sense because electric vehicles consume more energy. They're harder to do in Alaska than other places. So we would expect our adoption rates to be less than other regions. We can go next. All right, now we have heat pumps. So we don't have any historical information for number of heat pumps in the Railbelt. And we have one forecast that is an Alaskan forecast for heat pumps. And that's out of Chugach Electric Association. So we worked with their forecasts, which were linear forecasts that had an uptick in adoption in 5 years. So that's why I see a bend in the curve. And we took their forecasts, we increased it to represent all of the Railbelt instead of just Chugach Electric Association. And then we extrapolated that out to 2050. And we get is 14.4% of residential and commercial buildings having heat pumps. I do want to note that this is probably the most iffy forecast that we have due to the natural gas situation in the Cook Inlets. Most homes in the Anchorage Bowl are heated with natural gas. And so if there is unavailability of natural gas or it becomes less affordable, it becomes more expensive, this could drastically change. And this forecast is assuming, this was before the reports out from Hillcore and such. So this was assuming a fairly steady adoption rate or increases in natural gas prices, not drastic ones. So if we had a huge increase in our cost of natural gas, we could have a huge increase in heat pumps, but just wanted to make note of that. We can go to solar. So we have lots of great historical data about residential solar collected by ACEP's Chris Pike. So we have data that goes back to 2010, and this is for the whole Railbelt. And what's pretty cool is you can see an exponential growth in the last couple of years in residential solar. And there are no Alaska-based forecasts for residential solar. So we opted to make our own following a technology like S-curve of adoption. So what we did is we followed this exponential growth, which is happening right now. And then in a couple of years, we switched it over to a linear growth rate. And then we stopped the linear growth rate when the federal tax incentives for residential solar finish. So that's in 2031, I believe, or 2033. And then every 10 years, we basically half that linear growth rate. So as more people adopt or install solar panels, like the people who can afford it are going to do it first. And then there's going to be less and less people who can afford to do it. So you do expect a slow decline in the number of installations per year. And so when you get out to 2050, we're at 18.3%. So nothing that crazy for heat pumps in residential solar. These are following our best estimates on current trends. So we can keep ticking along. So with these adoption rates, we want to show you what this does to our hourly load. So all these are like new loads that are on top of our existing load. So this is going to have huge impacts to load growth. So we're looking at here is the resulting electric vehicle hourly load for the first week in January and the first week of July. This is for the year 2050. So electric vehicle load is comprised of many different types of vehicles, and all those vehicles charge at different times during the day. And so they have their own individual profiles. And what you see here are the aggregate of all those load profiles added together. And then we're showing them by load regions. You know, there's a lot of people in the Anchorage Bowl, so there's a lot of load from electric vehicles in central, the blue. And then you can see you have your southern region and your northern region on top of that. And you can kind of see per each day, there's kind of 2 charging periods. So you have like, you're charging overnight, you come home from work, you plug in. So that is like the overall load profile of these electric vehicles. And the electric vehicles consume more energy in cold temperatures, both when driving and when parked. So that's why you see a higher load in the winter than in summer. You can go to the next slide. Similar for heat pumps. Heat pumps are to keep your home warm. So you're going to be using a lot more load in the winter than you are in the summer. And so this data was comprised of 3 locations across Railbelt. And then we added noise to each of those locations to account for geographical diversity. Like your home in Fairbanks doesn't have the same temperature in Salcha, but we didn't do hundreds of different load profiles throughout the Railbelt. So we used 3 and then use noise to account for all those regional diversities. So that's why you see some interesting bouncing around in the data is to account for that noise, which is supposed to do geographic diversity. And then in the summer, just due to some like low temperatures at night, you do see heat pumps kicking on. And I would like to note that we did not include air conditioning. Heat pumps can supply air conditioning, but we did not include that in this. So that would be an additional load on top of this, which isn't accounted for. And solar. Right, so very minimal solar generation in the winter, but does happen, you know, in the middle of the day. And then you have a lot of solar generation in the summer. There's implications to this, to the load, which I'll get into in a minute. I think, yeah, we can jump to the next one. So all those plots I just showed were for the moderate load growth. So if you want to think about it for aggressive, you just scale it all up, you know, to the percentage of 90%. And so I want to compare here the difference between the moderate and the aggressive electrification. So aggressive is your 90%. Moderate was following current trends. So it makes sense that your load is a whole lot higher in aggressive. And additionally, you see the impact of solar as negative. So that everything negative represents your solar generation because subtracting from your load, this is all behind the meter, comes as aggregate to the transmission system. And so you have a lot more negative load in the summer impacting it. What I should have put on these slides, which I didn't, is like what the outcome, like what's the sum as a linear average. But and in comparison, we have in blue the 2021 load. So you can see, so we kind of follow like where the top of the plot is, and that's what the aggressive and the moderate aggregate load is. So the winter highs are higher, the summer lows are lower. And in the aggressive scenario where you have a lot of solar generation, you have lower loads than there are right now. So this has significant implications for generation planning because if you have to meet that peak load in the middle of the winter, you have to have a ton of generation, but then you don't really need it in the summer. This is both an opportunity and a challenge because that means you have a lot of cheap power in the summer, and that is an opportunity. But it also means you have to have a ton of generation in the winter that isn't being used year round, and that makes it more expensive. So opportunities and challenges. If we can jump to the next one. Yeah, so get to these like the key points and findings from this research that we find really interesting and we think are valuable to understand is that if you follow these moderate adoption of these technologies following current trends, you get a doubling of the load. This is both as a peak load, so peak winter load, double. Total energy throughout the year, double. Aggressive is almost 3 times. Your summer lows are lower, your winter highs are higher, and you have a ton of variation between the day. So your hour-to-hour load jumps also increase drastically. So what this means is your generation doesn't always have the ramping capability to deal with that hour-to-hour variability. So that's when you have to do other things like Jeremy mentioned about demand response. So that's the utility controlling certain things as like an aggregate load to help smooth the load out from the day. This could sound aggressive, but it could be very passive. Like you don't need to run your dishwasher at a certain time during the day. You don't need your hot water heater necessarily to be turning on at a certain time during a day. So there are methods to smooth out a load that aren't like, I'm telling you when you have to charge your electric vehicle. There's many methods to do this process. What we really want to get to is load forecasting, including these technologies, is really important because if you double your load, this has massive implications for generation planning. Do we have the generation available now to be able to serve a load that's going to double in the future? Or how does this impact what we need to plan to add for generation in the next couple of decades if we think this could happen? We're not saying it's going to happen. We're not trying to predict the future. But like if you follow these current trends, this could happen. And what are we going to do about it? These are the types of discussions that we want to encourage utilities and board members to be thinking about when they're approaching generation planning. Go next. Yeah. So what does this mean? I want to restate that we are not predicting the future. We are not saying this is going to happen. We're just saying based on the data that we have available now, this is a potential impact. And that these are things that we should be talking about as we move forward. Additionally, such as with the heat pump load forecast, things are going to change. Prices are going to change. Situations are going to change. This is something that needs to get updated every year. There's key things that we didn't include. There's ways to do this way better than how we did it. And these warrant more groups studying it and doing it more in better detail. So I think next slide. That's easy. No, that's it.
Well, there's going to be a report in January. We talk about more than the load projection, but there's going to be the full report of all the pathways and studies and what to build, when, where. Yeah. Yeah. So stay tuned for January.
Question submitted online. What research has been done with batteries and cold temperatures? What about winters when temperatures have drastic swings? What about the cost for maintaining that vehicle and the cost for battery replacement?
I know, yeah, Steve, Steve, come up here. And then also, I don't know if Michelle is online, but so we are doing a lot of data gathering and studying on electric vehicles in cold climate. I take your question as specific to vehicles and not stationary storage. But yeah, so what we did take into account, and thanks to Michelle Wilbur's work, the cold weather impacts on mileage and stationary, like the amount of energy it consumes while just sitting on your driveway plugged in. So that's why we saw so much more electrical consumption in the winter than in the summer. And so from a cost perspective, in terms of electricity, we captured that. I don't know, in terms of the economics of whether it makes sense to own an electric vehicle, I think, yeah.
Well, I think you captured, Jeremy, what we think we know so far, and it's there is one person at ACEP who's particularly interested in getting more data. That's Michelle Wilbur, and she jokingly said we could sign up new people who might want to participate in crowdsourcing data from their own vehicle tonight. So that's not really a total joke. I'll just say the name again, Michelle Wilbur. You can find her on the ACEP website, and she has been actually collecting crowdsourced data. So far, the problem is it's a small crowd. of crowdsourced data, but Michelle has been gathering actual operating data from vehicles in Alaska, including in the Fairbanks region and including a school bus in Tok. So the stuff that you saw or that we saw on the picture showing the much higher consumption in winter was actually based on Alaska data. And beyond that, I think as a non-engineer, kind of observing my colleagues trying to collect the data and figure out what are the ramifications of cold weather, my observation is that we're really just beginning to understand what it's going to mean to have a fleet of electric vehicles. But we have enough data to know that it is possible. So it is going to come down to what the questioner posed, which is what's it going to do to the cost and the relative competitiveness of the electric vehicles in the cold places. I think that's as much as we can say right now, at least this team at ACEP.
Another question online. Since there's relatively flat load increase now throughout the rail belt, you should do a load sensitivity analysis in your economic forecast.
I think that's a great idea. Steve's gonna.
That is a great idea. Thank you for bringing it up. And I'm just for putting pieces of content together, I'm going to ask the question that I wanted to ask. I'm probably the person who has to answer it. But anyway, the question is, why are we assuming that the non-heat pump, non-EV load is going to grow at 1% per year when in fact the last decade has given us approximately a 1% annual decline in the load? So that's a question I wanted to ask when I saw this slide showing the basic load growing at 1%, but I think I'm the person who has to answer it. And so the answer is, I think the answer is twofold for anyone who like me was concerned about that. Sort of like history is going down and yet our projection starting tomorrow essentially is going back up. Well, there's two reasons why we're doing that, I think. One was simply to have some consistency with the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, study that's been going on in parallel with ours. And the NREL study is looking specifically at a renewable portfolio standard, but they had to do the same kind of load projection that we've had to do to get started. And so one of the reasons we went with the very slight growth in the traditional load is just to be consistent with them. Another reason is that we are building in some population growth. On the other hand, we didn't grow the vehicle fleet. So there's a lot of moving parts that we just don't know enough about. And so I will stop blabbing by thanking whoever it was online who reminded us, I guess, that yes, we do need to do a lot of careful sensitivity runs to try to look at the implications of all these what ifs.
Steve, another question for you. Since most of the utilities have relatively new generation and debt for it, have you factored that into your generation adoption plan for the future? It will dramatically affect rate increases.
The short answer is we are quite cognizant of the existing debt obligations of the utilities, and we will absolutely be factoring in the cost of running the existing generation fleet as part of the cost of any future build out. So I would, in my worldview, I have to keep reminding myself, so I might as well remind the recording that we are fundamentally different in Alaska because we cannot, to put it bluntly, we cannot stick it to the investors like they can in Nebraska. In Nebraska, somebody comes along and wants to sell wind power for 3 cents. Essentially, the ratepayers can say, great, we'll take it. And you guys who built some other plant, we don't want your power. Go jump in the, the lake. And there are investors who have and will lose a lot of money. They may make a lot of money because they're taking some risk, but the downside of that risk is that people may not want their power. And we do not have any group of investors, at least not yet, in Alaska where we can say, we don't want your power, we're sticking it to you. Because being co-ops, we are the investors. So we'd only be sticking it to ourselves if we said, hey, we don't want that power from generator X, we're gonna take it from newfangled generator Y. So that's something that we're very aware of, but I think it bears repeating that it is one of the critical differences of the Alaska situation vis-a-vis some of the other places in the lower 48 that are hooked into these big markets. And just to reiterate in closing, yes, current and future debt burdens that could be imposed on ratepayers are absolutely critical to anybody's analysis of future rates.
Did you say you have a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
I don't know if I know the answer, but the question is, to what extent when you had the EV loads, was the charging managed, or was it just people charging whenever they wanted to?
We did not add management to those profiles. And so when you see, especially with the aggressive one, it was pretty spiky. That's not something that, the utility is probably gonna, that's not really a very viable load profile. And so that's something that's going to have some sort of encouragement to the consumer to change their charging behavior in order to make it smoother. This is pre-smoothing.
Any other questions?
So in your heat pump plots, why was there no heat pump use in the south in the winter?
So the reason why heat pumps will sometimes turn off completely is because they'll stop operating at a certain low temperature. And so in the models, you can choose what you want your low temperature to be. And this is where I think somebody could have a lot of fun changing the different set points and see what happens. We chose 5% or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. They're going to turn off and they're going to heat up to 70, which is kind of high. So yeah. So southern turns off. So what I should have shown is like the temperature according to this, but because it doesn't really make sense that southern would turn off and like northern wouldn't. But there was some weird temperature stuff going on this day, unfortunately.
Any other questions?
So how easily can you kind of tweak these different parameters, like 15% load growth? Like how much, as you are completing this model, like what is the long-term, like to what extent can we kind of play with some of these parameters or assumptions that you're making? Or is that going to require like a whole new iteration?
So what I really like about this part of the project is that the getting all the information together in the first place is the really hard part. And then making tweaks is an easy part, which is wonderful. And we're also working on releasing a web app that would allow people to change the percentage. So say I want to look at 16% of heat pumps versus 14% of heat pumps, and you can change it, see how it impacts the load and what it looks like. So that should be coming available soon.
Any other
Question
questions?
online, are the heat pump profiles based on 2021 historical temperatures in each region?
They're based on typical meteorological year data that's like supposed to represent aggregate the weather data. So it's not specific to 2021 or any other year.
Thanks. So I don't think you've quite gotten to this point yet, but you showed the wintertime loads higher and then the summertime loads lower in the high electrification scenario, right? And then you got your scenarios already set out. So what I'm hearing is that you're not optimizing the generation scenarios to match that. Is that correct?
Yes, we are matching. So the generation is being optimized to be able to meet that specific load. So they are all specific to that load. Load comes first, and then we find the generation that can match it.
Okay, and so that way you minimize the cost.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up to Jeremy's, and that is when you're maximizing or whatever, when you're modeling, when you come out with a report, will there be details as to what percent, wind generation or, okay, so it'll be broken down so you can actually see it. Oh, that'd be great. Thanks.
I realize this is maybe getting ahead of things a little bit too, but I am kind of curious because I get to ask you guys these kinds of fun questions. But if you see that like doubling of load or even tripling of load in that high scenario, like what part of the grid is most vulnerable to falling apart or failing? Like, is it where are we going to see that? Is it going to be the distribution, the transmission? Like, where are we going to see? Where's the greatest vulnerabilities in the system?
So from the modeling that I touch, the load increase, the greatest stability challenge I have is on the distribution side. Well, not, so your lower voltage grids that are like Manuska Electric, like the Anchorage Bowl area where you have a whole bunch of 115 kV lines, you end up having a whole bunch of transformers that go to all those feeders getting maxed out. And then you have low voltage issues on all of those 115 kV lines because you have double load than was originally planned for. So you have like a couple of options how to mitigate that. Either like you replace all your lines, very expensive. You also have to replace all your transformers. And then you can place in shunts or batteries or replace old generators with synchronous condensers to provide voltage support. Everything's expensive. But that's where I see the load in particular challenge. That's where it comes in.
So that could be a really substantive cost in all of this
It
as
could
part of
be.
this equation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And having controllable loads, having some ability for the grid operator to, incentive, get special time of use rates or even direct control, limited control over certain devices can postpone and help minimize some of those upgrade costs. It'll delay and reduce how much upgrades need to happen.
Another online question, is the app that was mentioned only for the Railbelt?
Yes. At this time.
So that the Anchorage Bowl would, and this is just my ignorance here, would behind the meter solar help address that to some degree? No. Okay. Please explain that a little bit more.
If it was, yeah, so Jeremy just said if it was paired with batteries, yes. Well, actually, sorry, no, I'm sorry. Because it's the high winter loads that are the issue and you don't have solar at that time. So it's heat pumps and everything. So back to you. It could reduce peaks, but it's still gonna be, yeah.
My question is, have you guys considered the impact of efficiency in this scenario? For example, if you go back to the year 2000, we were just getting into fluorescent bulbs and we were down to 25 watts for a 60-watt bulb. And now we're down to 8.2 watts for a 60-watt bulb. And I wonder what the future looks like, especially going out as far as 2050 with respect to refrigerators and condensers and stoves and other things that we use in our homes that are much more efficient. And then also the actual price of power, how that affects how much of it you choose to buy. So like, for example, instead of plugging in something at your home and walking away and leaving it alone, you might unplug it if you, for example, we're going to get a big hit financially. So I wonder if you've included either of those scenarios in your projections.
Those would be great things to include. And we really didn't touch on them. This would kind of get factored into the base load change. We'd love to in the future, but we haven't yet. Thanks.
Any other questions? Curiosities? Nerdy moments? Awesome. Yeah. Well, then I think we'll go ahead and move to the polling, which is the next one. These are some questions that we're interested in hearing the answers to figure out where to move this study forward. So if everyone could pull out their phones or a separate tab online on their computer and go ahead and type in vvox.app and then this ID, and then we'll change it to the next slide, and that'll be the question. Hold on a sec, we're working on it. Yes, so the poll is open now. And you can vote up for two choices on this. Go ahead and close it. There are the results. Steve. And we'll share all the results of these as well after the presentation. All right, we have 2 more questions. Troubleshooting in real time. Thanks y'all for your patience. All right, the poll is open. If you need the online address, it's up at the top along with the ID. And this one, you can also choose up to 2 choices. You're also welcome to do 1, but give me the option to do 2. All right, and those are the results. Excellent. Yes, thanks y'all. And 1 more. Yes. This one, you only get 1. It's a big choice. All right, top 1 heating and cooling. Awesome. Well,
Did you want me to keep that up then?
no, that's okay.
Well, we greatly appreciate everyone coming out today and spending their evening with us learning about our project. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you're interested in learning more in the future. Thank you for coming. Have a great night.
And we'll be sending out like updates about as this study continues. And so if you want to reach out with any questions or comments, these are the contact information as well as the sign up sheet at the front. We will be keeping y'all updated as things progress throughout, and then we'll definitely have another presentation in January. Thanks, everyone.